So good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. We've all witnessed the rapidly changing business and societal landscapes, and most of us realize that to be effective as leaders, our leadership must adapt. And storytelling is one of those capabilities that is often emphasized. But how might the stories we tell and tell ourselves affect our vision of the future, our motivations, resilience, and receptivity to change? Today, we're going to explore what insights can be gleaned from the stories we tell when we pause to examine them through a new lens, and then how these insights can help us to create, innovate, overcome challenges, and break through. I'm excited to welcome Professor Tom Will to our Business Over Breakfast session to explore these ideas. Tom wears several hats in our community. He is an Associate Professor of Business Management at Agnes Scott College. He is an affiliate faculty member for Emory's Custom Executive Education programs and is a senior consultant at the Development Edge. In his role at Agnes Scott, he is also the academic director for Bridge to Business, which is a program designed to equip humanities, sciences, and social sciences undergraduates in making the college to career transition. Tom's research draws on constructive developmental theory to help students and working professionals grow in their work and non-work lives. His most recent article titled, I have to read this, "The Professor's Predicament: How Can I Have My Expertise Without It Having Me?" This article explores the relationship between expertise and identity, which is often a double-edged sword. Professionals to survive while limiting their capacity to thrive. It's been published in the London School of Economics Business Review and the Leadership Quarterly. Tom is the proud father of 2 elementary school age girls and shared that he loves the beach and tells himself stories about how amazing he is at barbecue. So we'll have to ask the girls whether or not that is true. Since Tom invests the lion's share of his time advancing women to business, I thought it fitting to share a little about our recently redesigned Executive Women's Leadership Program, which is focused on women who are starting to bump up against that proverbial glass ceiling. We've created a 4-month live online and in-person modular learning experience focused on 3 key factors that catalyzing women to create a clear strategic direction, a powerful story, and a formidable network. And what sets this program apart, I believe, is the combination of faculty experts with executive practitioners and the very hands-on learning experiences that strengthen participants' ability to articulate a strong and clear strategy, as well as the means to communicate it in a way that compels action, the action required to execute on it. So invite you, your female colleagues, or direct reports to investigate this and hopefully join us for the upcoming program set to launch in February 2022. With today's session, as with most, Tom is going to share some thoughts for about the first 30 to 35 minutes, and we'll follow that with a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to get to as many of those as possible. So over to you, Tom. Welcome.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm excited to join the Business Over Breakfast community today. What a wonderful series y'all have put together. And to those of you in the audience, happy Thursday, good morning, and I'm excited to be here with you for this time. So as Nicola mentioned, the title of my talk today is The Stories That We Tell Ourselves and What They Tell Us. And to get started, I'd like to share with you a couple of stories that I told myself upon being invited to speak at Business Over Breakfast. So I got the invitation and I read it and I said, yes, this sounds exciting. I think that I have some things of value to bring to this audience. I'd like to share some of the work that my colleagues and I are doing in human development with our business clients. I think I can craft a webinar that will appeal to this audience. This will be pretty good. I think this might be brilliant. We'll call that my triumph story. A few days later, I started working on the slides and thought more deeply about who's in the audience. And I said to myself, I'm not really sure who is in this audience. They've told me VPs and directors, but I don't really know my audience. And how can I appeal to them if I don't really know who they are? And who am I anyway to presume to take up an hour of their Thursday? This might not go well. This might be a disaster. I'm going to embarrass myself. And they're going to put it on YouTube. We'll call that my disaster story. And over the next couple of days, these two stories were sort of in dialogue with each other. You're going to do great. You're going to be exceptional. You're going to embarrass yourself. This is going to be a disaster. And the reason I start with this and share this is that not so many years ago, I know how I would have engaged with these two stories. And what I essentially would have done is I would have sought to elevate and to amplify my triumph story. And I would have sought to silence my disaster story. No negative self-talk, no negative self-talk. Maybe that's what some of you do when you have competing stories. And you know what? It would have worked to an extent. I'd have gotten through this. I'd have survived the experience, but I don't think I would have thrived. And that's because there's actually a better way to engage our stories. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to suggest that there's value in approaching our stories as a type of resource that might be mined, that might be dug into to reveal something of value. And what it reveals is, what our stories reveal often are where it is that we need to grow. And once we hone in on that, then we set ourselves up to be able to surface and test core assumptions that are keeping us stuck, with an eye towards getting to a point where our stories no longer have us, but rather we have our stories, getting to a point where our old stories are no longer authoring us, but we have the capacity to author new stories. So that's what I'm going to talk about sort of in a nutshell. I will go ahead and share screen and begin to elaborate. All right, so there's the title. And it seems reasonable to begin by sharing how it is that I'm thinking about stories. So there's a definition. In this context, what I mean by stories is thoughts or statements about the way that things are that have for us the ring of truth. One of the sort of phrases that got me thinking about this hook for this talk is that we all tell ourselves stories that we like to hear. This is a phrase that I've found very useful almost on a daily basis. I see people around me telling themselves stories that they like to hear, and I see myself telling myself stories that I like to hear. And I need to quickly attribute this quote to its source. A good friend of mine, Mark LeBusque, who's doing wonderful work in human development down in Australia. I think it's the 11 p.m. hour for him, so I'll send this to him as a link. I don't think he's with us live, but thank you, Mark, for this quote and for all that it's sort of jogged my thinking. And I'd also like to suggest that we also tell ourselves stories that we fear. And there's a relationship between our like to hear stories and our fear stories. They kind of mutually implicate one another. They suggest one another. They generate one another. And so the fear stories, sort of coming from the amygdala portion of our brain, our response to fear, are self-protective in a kind of way. And there's a way in which our like to hear stories are a response to that. But what I'd like to note is that they're self-protective as well. So if we think about how these are both self-protective, we look at my opening story, the disaster story, it's clear how that's self-protective. It's saying, don't go there, don't do that webinar, you may fall on your face. But even the triumph story is self-protective in a kind of way. I mean, this story that I'm exceptional and brilliant, is protecting me from the reality that I may just be okay. I may just be one more speaker in a line of speakers. I may be ordinary and forgotten. And that's something kind of terrifying as well. So both of these categories of stories protect us in a kind of way, and they're limiting. And I referenced in the opening how I would have approached this years ago in a kind of common sense way, that if I'm telling myself negative things, well, what's the antidote to that poison? Well, the antidote to that poison is tell myself good things, is positive self-talk. This may be the way that some of you approach the stories that you tell yourself. It feels to me like a lot of advice out there is essentially this: stop the negative self-talk, amplify the positive self-talk. But the problem with that is that the common sense approach oftentimes locks us in to a kind of looping triumph, disaster, self-dialogue, where we fashion ourselves exceptional, nearly perfect. We're going to deliver in every way, and that sets the bar rather high. And with that high bar, it's hard to imagine ourselves. It's easy to imagine ourselves falling on our face. It's like poor Superman here, and these two just kind of mutually generate each other. And then I start thinking of myself falling on my face. No, I'm exceptional. I'm going to do well. And this kind of back and forth oftentimes has us in its grips, and is not the most useful way to sort of relate to our stories. Stories are often, one way or the other. They go to extremes. And the reason for this, one way of thinking about the reason for this, I'll share a quote from one of my colleagues, Andy Fleming at the Developmental Edge. My amygdala does not do nuance. The fear portion of my brain reacts in the extreme. It doesn't do nuance. It doesn't allow for a whole lot of space on the middle ground. We can't sort of stop for a cup of coffee at the middle ground cafe when our amygdala is generating fear and then like to hear stories in response to that. I'll share a few examples as you're probably thinking about what stories you tell yourselves. We can look at some stories that are often told in the workplace. So we might, something like, I'm the best, I'm exceptional, I'm indispensable to this team and this organization. They really need me. May have an associated sort of story of, maybe I'm not that indispensable, maybe I'm not that exceptional, maybe I'm sort of an imposter. Or I might tell myself that I'm focused on the job, I get the job done, that's who I am. With the quieter voice saying, well, maybe that's partly who you are because you're just not that good at connecting with people and the relationship stuff. I might tell others and myself that I'm empathic, I'm likable and liked, but have another sort of story within me that, that they're going to think I'm selfish. Or I speak my mind no matter what others think. I'm courageous in that respect, with an associated story of, I really hope they like me. I want my people to grow. That's what I tell others. That's what I tell myself. But I harbor thoughts that they really can't do this without. Or I'm open to feedback, but my amygdala is telling me criticism of any kind crushes me. So if you're thinking about what sort of stories you tell yourself, I would invite you to share that in chat. And I would admire your courage for doing so. And you guys can sort of look at some of the stories that you have out there, maybe one story or maybe two associated stories. So today I'm going to suggest and sort of lay out a different approach where we do not elevate and amplify triumph stories and silence disaster stories, but rather we listen to them both. Not because they're necessarily fantastic indicators of reality, typically they're not, but because they are excellent indicators of what we assume about reality. There's a lot of value in surfacing those assumptions. And I'll offer up as a metaphor that our stories are sort of what we see. They're manifestations of something beneath the surface. So we can think of our stories as something that we see, and that I can mine into that. I can dig into that to get to the beneath the surface assumptions. I like this quote from Albert Camus: "An intellectual is someone whose mind watches itself." And so one way of thinking about what I'm going to talk, this sort of method that I'm going to talk about today, is that it's a method of structuring a way for our minds to watch themselves. So our roadmap for the rest of the webinar, sort of 3 questions will drive us. Number 1, what do our stories tell us? And I'm going to suggest that they tell us where we need to grow. Number 2, how can we use them? And I'm going to suggest that we can use them to surface our assumptions. And number 3, what's the best path forward? And I'm going to suggest that a particular type of experimentation is the best path forward. So this kind of will synopsize a lot of what we've found in our work at the developmental edge. So the stories we tell ourselves have a lot to tell us, as I've suggested, if we'll listen. I have a number of stories that when I listen to them, they suggest that, Tom, you need to get better at not always having to know everything. Can you imagine that? A professor and a consultant who always has to know everything. When I look at my stories, they tell me that that's a growth edge area for me. Maybe some of you have similar stories or other stories. So let's look at a few examples. I'll look at 3 examples of how stories can suggest where we might need to grow. Start with this story that I'm the best, that I'm indispensable. They need me on this team, in this organization, and the associated, maybe I'm not all that exceptional. Maybe I'm a bit of an imposter. An inference here might be that I need to get better at sometimes being less than perfect, or at least less than perfect as I'm defining it right now. And I need to sort of get comfortable with that reality. And that if I get comfortable with that reality, that will open up vistas for me that right now are kind of closed, that right now are kind of don't go there areas. A second example, maybe I tell myself and others, I want my people to grow, with the associated, yeah, but they can't do this without me. From this, I might infer, I need to get better at delegating, learning how to do that, and overcoming my fears associated with that. The third example, I'm empathic, I'm likable and liked, and the associated, they're going to think I'm selfish if I do this, if I do that. The growth area then might be, I need to get better at saying no sometimes. I need to get better at having difficult conversations. So, part of this is recognizing that we tell ourselves different stories and noticing the ones that are coming up a lot, because we tell ourselves different stories, although they seem natural to us. So kind of foregrounding and noticing what am I telling myself a lot, and is there a theme there on where I need to grow? Now, our stories have useful elements. They're not all sort of dysfunctional. And it can be useful, and it's probably even vital that I sort of have as my story that I'm pretty good at what I do and that people like me. I need to have those stories to fulfill my role as a consultant and as a professor. You need some elements of those stories to fulfill your roles and what you do day to day. And I would add as well that the disaster stories have a certain utility to them as well. I mean, my fear of falling on my face can really motivate me to work hard. Okay, so there's utility there. The problem is less about the stories themselves than it is about our relationship with our stories. We run into difficulties when we do not so much have our stories as they have us, when we do not so much see our stories, but rather see through them. And so in the cartoon here, the cow is experiencing the world through the assumption that the ringing is in its ears. For the doctor, it's easy to see that's the bell, but the cow is subject to that assumption. And so when this is the case, we need help surfacing and testing the assumptions on which our stories rest. So I'm going to talk about how we might mine our stories to develop if-then hypotheses to come up with sort of golden nuggets of insight. And structurally, there are two ways that this can be done, and I'll elaborate with examples. But one is a sort of if what would need to happen for this fear story to come true, or for the opposite of my triumph story to come true. And then the other way of structuring this is that if my fear story comes true, or the opposite of my like to hear story comes true, what then? What's so bad about that? So some examples. We'll start again with this story set of exceptionalism, being exceptional and being an imposter. So what would it look like to structure in this first form? If what would happen? What would have to happen for me to look and feel like an imposter, or for them to see that they really don't need me? What would have to happen for that to come to fruition? I might have different answers to that, but a plausible answer is, if I don't give fast answers to everything, always, if I don't do that all the time, then I'll start to feel and look like an imposter, and they'll start to recognize they don't really need me. Okay. Looking at the other way of structuring this, if they don't need me completely and always, for example, what then? What then? If they don't need me completely and always, well, maybe I will feel useless, and that will be devastating to me. Okay. If they don't need me completely and always, I'll feel useless, and that will be sort of devastating to me. So these if-then hypotheses are really articulations of what we call big assumptions that we have about the way that the world is, and that we have about the way that the world works. And we tend to see through these assumptions, and they reveal some realities about the world. We look through this window, there are trees there are cars, but they also limit much of what we view. So the metaphor is that, there's a real world out there to the right, to the left, above and below this window that we can't see because our assumptions are limiting us. There's a real world on the other side of the building. And so our program here is about right-sizing those assumptions to our current reality, such that we see more, and open up vistas for ourselves. Many of our assumptions, I would note, keep us obsessed with ourselves and our own performance. And as you know, that's not the place you need to be to connect with those who are in your care, who are your colleagues, and that's not the place you need to be to lead in any sort of a way. I'll share one more quote from my colleague, Andy Fleming, that the world outside of our assumptions is much bigger than the world inside our assumptions. And that's where we want to get to, is outside of our current assumptions. So at the developmental edge, we've seen two sort of buckets, meta categories of big assumptions. And we've taken to calling them the boss bucket and the belonging bucket. I'll share a little bit about the types of assumptions we see within those two buckets. The boss bucket contains assumptions related to what it takes to be the boss. Okay, we see sort of 5 categories of this. One is, if I don't control everything always, then things will just fall apart. Number 2 is, if I don't do everything always, then they just won't get done well enough. And this sense of everything and always, these ultimacies, again, my amygdala does not do nuance, okay? If I don't know everything always, I'll just sort of look like I don't know what I'm doing, that I'm a slacker, that I'm not on top of things, that I'm not really in charge. If I don't give fast answers to everything always, then others will think I'm incompetent. Leaders are always supposed to have fast answers for everything. And finally, if I don't always appear to others as if I'm in charge, on top of things, totally in control, with answers for everything, I will be seen as weak and not as a leader. It's our boss bucket. And then in the belonging bucket are assumptions related to what it takes to belong, to fit in, to be liked, and to be seen as a team player. Examples of these are, if I give constructive feedback, or if I hold people accountable, they won't like it. It will damage our relationship permanently. Or if I argue against the consensus view or say no to any request, then I won't be seen as a team player, and that'll be permanent. Or if I appear confident in my accomplishments, then I'll be seen as arrogant and selfish, and people will not like me. The sort of if-then articulations of our assumptions are really hypotheses. And given that they're hypotheses, that means that we can test them. And so that is a critical part of this, the experiments. Reflection is important, but it needs to be balanced with some sort of action to kind of learn new things. And what we've found is that the best tests are small. If you make them too big, the bar is too high to jump. And so small tests are critical. And we've found that small tests can make a tremendous change. And secondly, they should be actionable, like, you should do this tomorrow or next week, something small and actionable to get you moving to test the assumptions that you want to test. And so I'll give some examples. Let's go with our example of, if I don't give fast answers to everything always, then I'll look and feel like an imposter, and they'll see that they don't really need me. So how might I test that? There are a number of ways, but one plausible way is I'm going to find a situation where I would normally give a fast answer. And instead of doing that, I might ask somebody else what they think. Okay, so what kind of data might this experiment yield? Well, what happened? You're paying intentional attention to what happened. How did the experiment land with me? How did it seem to land with others? Did I feel like an imposter? Did it seem as though I looked like an imposter? Did I feel unneeded? And what I really want to underscore is that a test like this, I know that it seems super small, but what we've found is just a little shift in vantage point can really open up new vistas and leverage the way that you think, leverage change in the way that you think in a very, very powerful sort of way. So what enables us to author new stories, to get outside of our former assumptions? What we've found, again, is surfacing big assumptions, testing big assumptions, and a third element of this experience that, in terms of testing, I'm sharing a quote with us. I've seen attributed to Gary Player as well. Here it's attributed to Arnold Palmer. I'm not sure who said it, but I like the message that it's a funny thing. The more I practice, the luckier I get. And so what I'm suggesting there is that we see that the people who dig into the experimental process and do several experiments, though small, do several over the course of at least a month, have the most success in kind of shifting their assumptions and ultimately the way that they think and act. And a third element that we've found critical is community. And we like to say that development is best played as a team sport. So, perhaps that's a weekly meeting, even on Zoom, but it fosters accountability, and it fosters a sense that I'm not alone in this. And what we see is that when people share their stories and their assumptions, we have a lot in common, as it turns out. And there's a feeling of fellowship there that invites vulnerability, and you need to get to that vulnerable place in order to sort of be open to change. So community is a critical part of this. What I'd like to suggest is that we've sort of talked about self, but it's been my experience that thinking about our interactions with others through the lens of stories and assumptions builds a type of empathy that can be very, very useful for managers and leaders. Because the people that we work with all live and tell themselves their own stories. So, your boss, Cheryl, her micromanaging might drive you nuts, but she's not doing that to irritate you. If you ask sort of what stories might Cheryl be telling herself, it can promote a type of insight into what's motivating that person and driving that person and keeping them stuck and perhaps even suffering in their own kind of way. And so, part of this is about inference and connecting dots, but we, in observing Cheryl, might understand how her stories are presenting some fearful prospect of letting go and not micromanaging. Or Trey, who always has to get the last word in, a framework of Trey's not doing this to irritate me. Trey's telling himself his own stories that's what he needs to do, or else something else. He has his own if-then hypotheses. And Vernon, who just never asks clarifying questions, goes off, does it himself, and stubs his toe. Again, we can connect the dots that perhaps Vernon has if-then hypotheses of, if I ask questions, I'll look incompetent. So it can be a useful sort of entree to engaging those around you and helping them in their development, is to sort of see them through their stories. Check my time real quickly. Okay, I think we're good. I'd also like to suggest that stories scale beyond just ourselves and other people. And yes, individuals tell themselves stories, but so do teams, and so do organizations. And so, as a diagnostic, you might ask yourself, what stories is my team telling itself, and what stories is my organization telling itself? What like to hear stories and what fear stories? So I'll suggest a couple of examples. I can imagine a team that tells itself, we are a collaborative team. We share responsibility and voice, and that's the sort of like to hear story. But there may be associated fear stories in there of, Kendra, a team member, may have a story. If I don't handle things, they'll never get handled. Okay. And it's likely that other people on the team have a different story from Kendra. Perhaps Blake's story is Kendra never listens to anybody, and is kind of imposing and takes over and takes control. It's controlling. Okay. And inference might be then that this team needs to get better at having difficult conversations about roles and expectations. And there are likely some if-then hypotheses that we might surface. Or at the organizational level, my organization might have a story that it likes to hear, that our value proposition is still relevant and strong. Yeah, sales are stagnant, but we just need to get better at marketing ourselves better and getting the word out a little bit better. The story we like to hear. But there may be associated fear stories of, I've seen us try change efforts before and they never work. We can't change. And these two may sort of be mutually implicated in each other. And the inference here would be that people in this organization need to get better at acknowledging, discussing, distributing, and accepting the losses entailed by change. And we might look for then if-then hypotheses of their big assumptions and have them collectively, or leadership collectively, test some of those assumptions. As I move towards closing here, I just sort of want to acknowledge that today I've chosen stories as a way of getting at big assumptions, and so I've sort of gone in the yellow door metaphorically. But there are other ways of getting at and surfacing big assumptions. And actually, in our day-to-day work at the Developmental Edge, we don't foreground stories. We foreground a tried method called the immunity to change method that we've developed into a particular programmatic form called the developmental sprint. So I just want to acknowledge that the stories angle is my own, and I'm not with that specifically, that approach, I'm not representing necessarily my colleagues. Although the spirit of surfacing assumptions and testing those is drawn from my work at the Developmental Edge. And then finally, I want to sort of note that as I speak, I'm drinking from wells that others have dug, and want to acknowledge all the work that the four founders of the Developmental Edge have done, both to really really pioneer constructive developmental theory, but then also work for a long time at working that into a methodological practice that makes it applicable to those of us in the actual working world, and to make it helpful and practical for us. And so, so with that, I'll sort of close the presentation part of the webinar, and there's my contact information. I suppose I'll stop share. Pam, is that?
You can leave it up, Tom, or you can stop share, whichever is better for you.
Okay, maybe
we've got
for a little bit and then
sure.
Stop.
We've had several questions come in. I love this one because there's a little humor in it. But Joseph asks, what's the best way for us to find doctors to help us see our bells?
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer for that. If I'll sort of take the metaphor and run, you could contact us at the Developmental Edge, or consult some of that literature that I just suggested. There's an article version there. The real reason that people won't change at work, if you want to start with an article version in Harvard Business Review by Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy, as a way of on your own seeing your own bell, and becoming your own doctor in a kind of way, because ultimately that's the goal, is to become your own doctor.
Well, Tom, I like the advice you gave earlier, is to find a trusted colleague, because oftentimes, as long as we all say we're open to feedback, and then sometimes you feel crushed by it. But I think sometimes if you find a trusted colleague that you're willing to be vulnerable with and be open to those, they can certainly tend to see those better insights, if you will.
Community is critical, yes.
Yeah. So there was a question that was asked earlier, and I think that you talked to it during your session, but I want to go back to it because Al asked, how do you determine which is countering the other? And I think this speaks to kind of conducting these tests.
Yeah.
But is my imposter story a balance against my perceived expertise, or is my expertise story a balance against my perceived lack of experience?
Well, I think like with the chicken and the egg, I do think it's both. And so I think that they are balancing each other, and are really flip sides of the same coin, and are, if we go back to the image of the iceberg, those stories are kind of like located on the top of the iceberg that we see, and they're both there in that top of the iceberg, but the assumptions underneath are the critical thing, that if I'm less than exceptional, then I'm nothing, and it goes to that ultimacy. And so perhaps the imposter syndrome articulates that most directly, but the sort of like to hear story is just the flip side of that same coin, the sort of, I can't face that possibility, so I'm going to tell myself what I need to hear.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So Denise asked, using your model and starting at the top level, at the more organizational level, could you address how an undesirable culture might be changed through leveraging some of the model approach that you talked through?
The first process is to, there are a couple of thoughts, but one process is to bring leadership together and really have them kind of collectively surface collective assumptions that the organization might have. An even better answer is to conduct that type of process with leadership, but to also involve as many people as possible in the organization in this method, in this language, in this way of thinking. And really the purpose of the Developmental Edge, immunity to change, has been around for a while. The Developmental Edge exists to scale it in a very, very big way. And so the book, A Deliberately Developmental Organization, and Everyone Culture, subtitled Deliberately Developmental Organizations, published in 2016, I think, by the founders of the developmental edge, gives examples of 4 organizations where they went all in. And this is in line with the idea of community, where a large proportion of people in the organization have the language, the orientation, and the motivation to think of themselves as in development, then it's much more likely that the teams and organization, that the collective will be comfortable with the idea that we are in development. One of the things going on here is that a lot of us bring to work, so we go to sort of 2 jobs at work. One is the job that we have, the role that everybody would agree that we have, and the other job is convincing people that there's nothing wrong with us, which can become exhausting. And so that happens with me, that happens with my team, and my organization can spend a lot of time convincing itself that nothing's wrong. Mm-hmm. And just giving people the framework that development is okay, that development is uncomfortable, but it is okay, is critical. And the more people who are brought on board with that, it grows exponentially, the power involved.
Mm-hmm. So Tom, I'm familiar with the work of Keegan and Leahy that you referenced, and you mentioned on your closing slide a little bit about overcoming immunity to change. Could you speak to that for just a few minutes? We got a couple other questions I want to get to, but can you kind of give a high level overview of, certainly stories are a key component of that framework. And can you talk a little more to that?
Yeah, thank you, Pam. So methodologically, the difference between the immunity to change approach is that begins with the question, what do you want to get better at? What do you want to get better at? And then there's sort of the next step is, well, what are you doing that stands in the way of you getting better at that? And then the next step is, well, imagine yourself doing the opposite of what you're actually doing. What sort of worry or sick feeling comes up from that? And then when we surface those worries, then we can articulate big assumptions. So the process is kind of different, where it's foreground and improvement goal. What I'm suggesting today is that I kind of like bringing stories in this at the front end, because I think it's relatable and most of us can relate to that. And I'm suggesting that you can mine your stories to sort of help you hone in on an improvement. And that as you get in touch with those stories, that's another way of surfacing your sort of worries and your aspirational growth edge. So I'd say it's almost like the components are all there from the way that I spoke about it versus the ITC approach. The ITC approach is, I just want to acknowledge, that's been heavily researched, that's been heavily implemented. But I didn't think it lent itself in a way to this kind of webinar. As well, but we find that works really very powerfully,
Yeah, thank you. So another question that's come in is, in your coaching work that you do, what advice do you offer leaders to help keep themselves accountable to continually conducting these tests, to raise their own awareness around perhaps the self-talk and competing stories?
So there's a strong inclination within each of us to not look at this stuff. And so I think the question acknowledges that, rightly so. A couple of elements of this really help a person stick with it. One is that they pick a goal that for them has a certain level of urgency, I literally spoke with coached a man last Friday, 6 days ago, who he said to me, he said, I can feel it in my chest. Like I can feel my need to be perfect, the hours that I'm working. He said, Tom, if I don't make progress on this, I'm going to die. So that was an unusual articulation of urgency. But a lot of the people we talk with, especially, they understand that this isn't working anymore. And so you need to have a goal with that level of urgency. The second thing is they need to have some success. And that's why we recommend small goals that you can do right away. If the goal gets small experiments that you can do right away. If the experiment gets too complex, there's too much at stake. I'll do this in June. It's never going to get done. And so it's kind of like going to the gym. You start with small weights and you start to see a little bit of change, not immediately, but over time. If you go in and try to lift a heavy weight, you're just going to leave the gym. So that's the second thing, small actionable steps. And the third thing is community. It just, if you just facilitate immunity to change with people and then just sort of say, okay, go do this on your own, nothing happens. Nothing happens. So we need to walk with the group through the process. And in the group, there need to be subgroups where people walk with each other, ideally in groups of about 4, where we've actually found that Zoom, this is somewhat counterintuitive, but the Zoom groups are actually beautiful for this. There's almost something about people being physically distant that we feel enables them to open up in a kind of way. Oftentimes with people that don't really know. In big organizations, one may work in the Philippines and one may work in Switzerland, and they're in different functional areas. And so this distance between I don't know you, and also sometimes on Zoom, it's like I feel unthreatened to open myself up and be vulnerable. So we've seen really beautiful energy generated in that format. Community.
Right. So I want to build on that just a little bit. A question that, and I hope I don't butcher the name too much, but Dionisio asked, and that is, how might we really help others start to raise their awareness to create better stories of themselves and unleash their natural desire to continue to grow, finding better versions of themselves? It's kind of the counterbalance to, how do I find that doctor that can help me identify the bells? So what advice do you have about helping others?
It's a really great point, because there's an artistry to this. And, you can't read up about immunity to change and come in and start saying, here's your column 2. You will sound arrogant and aggressive if you say, here's the story I think you're telling yourself, even if you're thinking that. And so it is about trying to find a way to connect with that person where your conversation and your approach is perhaps building on this sensibility, but it might be framed as a question. Or so, for example, if you're connecting dots that here's an if-then hypothesis that this person is sort of being motivated by, you might find a way to work into the conversation. Hey, I wonder if and you might suggest an experiment, a small experiment. I wonder if if you made a little change in that way, if that might be beneficial. Or I wonder, it also depends on how close you are with this person. And the stronger the holding environment, the stronger the sort of connection between you and they, the more you can raise the heat. Mm-hmm. And so it's probably very difficult to do with somebody who you have no connection with. But if there's a connection and you can raise the heat a little bit, you might suggest that it seems to me that you're jumping in a lot with answers, or you're having difficulty sort of helping people do the work themselves. You're kind of in there with them a little bit much. I wonder what if you did withdraw yourself? What would be the worst thing about that? What would be the worst thing about that to help them sort of surface some of those assumptions themselves? But no, there's an artistry involved.
So there's a last question coming in, and then we'll move towards close. But Robert asked, just kind of to add on to your the question and answer that you just went through. Would you suggest anything different if you're trying to kind of manage up, if you will, to push the idea more upwards in the organization? Is there anything different you might say? That's
potentially dangerous ground to tread. I guess I would double down on the artistry element element of that. But yeah, I mean, if you have a connection with that person and sort of establish that, you know, here's what I'm seeing, and here's what's occurring to me. Actually, let me add this, that one way you might think about this, if you approach a person and phrase it as, this is true, you're not delegating enough, they can argue back with that. If you almost take the phrasing outside of yourself and put the phrasing on the table and start with, you know, it occurs to me, or it appears to me, or I'm having the thought, you know, with what I've seen, I'm having the thought that maybe there's a better way for you to, maybe there's a better way to, for you around delegation, however you want to phrase that. But putting that, I'm having the thought, it occurs to me, it's harder for them to argue back with that, because you haven't said that that's true. You're just saying that that's your observation, that's your observation. And that can be a useful way of approaching a person. It's almost make the comment itself an object that we're both looking at, rather than it's a part of me and I'm inviting you to attack me back.
Great. So Tom, I have to tell you, there's a comment that came in that said, I wish you'd build an app to help us with this. That came in from Kevin. So
the thoughts occurred. Yeah, we're sort of, but yeah, right. Good point.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see you again. We hope that we'll get to see you again in person soon. I know you guys are all back in class as we are, and just appreciate the insights. There's been lots of great comments coming in on the chat today, and lots weighing in as well with their own insights and advice and experiences, which has also been incredibly helpful. So before we go today, I would like to take just a few minutes to tell you about some of our upcoming programs with Emory Executive Education, which you can learn more about on our website. So you can just Google Emory Executive Education, or we'll be putting a link in the chat where you can learn more. I posted in the chat earlier, we will be sending a recording of today's session so that you can share it with colleagues, reference back to it to help your own growth and development. Our next Business Over Breakfast sessions coming up in October are emerging trends in entrepreneurship, investing, and corporate innovation. And that will be on October the 7th. And then on October the 21st, making innovation happen, optimizing collaboration from conception to completion. We also have a number of short courses coming up in the coming months. Anything from executive communication and leadership presence, which has always been an inspiring session for our participants, and we get lots of positive feedback about how that is helping them shape their narrative and their brand. Design thinking and business innovation, disrupting your business strategy, our ever popular finance and accounting for non-financial managers, led by Tom Smith. Many of you have seen him on our Business Over Breakfast webinars throughout this time together, and then executive decision making. We have two new programs that I will very briefly touch on. One is our all new Growth Leaders Academy. Nicola has spoken about this on the last couple of Business Over Breakfast webinars. You can learn more about this on our website. That will launch in June, and it is designed for cohorts of leaders from the same company to come and tangibly work on an initiative together. And then we're very excited, as Nicola mentioned at the start of our webinar, to relaunch our Executive Women's Leadership Program. It is a program designed to help women leaders move through those barriers by gaining a broader strategic and enterprise perspective and distilling to a compelling narrative that really helps influence and persuade and inspire action towards corporate and team goals. So we hope that you can check those out and join us for any or all of those sessions that really meet your needs, your team's needs, your organizational needs. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We look forward to seeing you again on October the 7th. And a brief survey will pop up at the conclusion of the webinar. We hope that you'll take a couple of minutes to give us your feedback. It is always so valuable. Thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.